As soon as I think it's spring, we always get that one last gasp of winter and it snows or whatever. But Training Tuesday for April 27th. What we're going to talk about today, we're going to focus specifically on small purchases with sole source conditions. That's really going to be the only topic today. We have had some questions about it, and every once in a while when we don't have a pressing matter, it's good to go back and maybe pick out a procurement method and just kind of unpack it, talk about some high level issues, and then talk about the differences in how you'd process it in BidBuy. So I won't go all the way in BidBuy and actually walk all the way through it because that'll take a little bit too long, but if you would like that training, we certainly can provide that for you. But I'm really just going to focus on how you would do a small purchase, but what is going to be different if there are those sole source conditions. And then, as usual, our fun fact of the day and our quote of the day. So let's jump right in. First off, let's talk about just from a very high level point of view, what is a small purchase with sole source conditions? So it is when only one vendor or supplier can provide the good or service, but it's below that small purchase limit. Okay, so our current small purchase limit is $104,100. If it is below that, a perfectly acceptable procurement method would be a small purchase with sole source conditions. So many times, and understandably, the two procurement methods can get confused with each other, or many times, maybe we'll say something like it's a small purchase sole source. That's another way of saying it. Many times this also gets confused with an emergency versus a small purchase with emergency conditions. So they're very similar. They're analogous to each other. An emergency is a full-blown emergency above $104,000, whereas you could have a small purchase with emergency conditions in the same way that you can have a small purchase with sole source conditions. So the requirements are different, the public postings are different, those sorts of things. So the market conditions are similar to a sole source with a small purchase with sole source conditions, but since it's below that small purchase limit, it does not require, for instance, the public notice. It doesn't require the small or the sole source justification form, which is the PPB form that needs to be required. However, we do have a small purchase with sole source conditions form, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but it's just not as lengthy and doesn't have as many fields to complete as the SSJF. And a sole source hearing is not required. As you know, for a sole source, we have to publicly post it for 14 days. That allows anyone to request a hearing. If that hearing is not requested, the sole source hearing can be canceled. However, that is not the case with a small purchase with sole source conditions. Okay, and then let's see a couple other notes. So, as procurement professionals, we're kind of in the middle, right? Many of us are end users that we may have that as a part of our responsibilities, but many times us in procurement, specifically APOs, SPOs, procurement staff, we aren't the subject matter expert. We don't know all the ins and outs and the specifics of what is needed. That's what those end users are providing. So it's just a good time to talk about asking questions regarding the end user. So even though it's a small purchase with sole source conditions, it needs to be justified similar to as if it was a sole source, a full-blown sole source, a sole source that was $500,000, for instance. You still need that justification because the procurement method still needs to be followed appropriately, no matter the dollar value. In terms of can anybody else provide that good or service? So it's a good time just to kind of have those discussions. And if you're not 100% justified, you can always test the market by just putting it out as a small purchase. Because if you're not completely sure, that's when potentially there could be a vendor out there that could provide the same good or service at a better price or with better quality. So I have just a at-home example. It may not be a perfect analogy, but it is applicable here, I believe. So we're calling this Dave's at-home example the mower purchase. We had a mower that went down. It was time to buy a new mower, and I of course, I need the $4,000 zero turn John Deere mower, right? Um, my wife had a slightly different outlook on it. She says, "Hey, look, we don't need that. We don't need that zero turn mower. We could get this mower and save a lot more money." But in my head, you know, full disclosure, 43-year-old adult, and my brain says, no, I need this. This is the thing I need. I should know the difference between want and needs. Of course, I don't when it comes to mower. I don't know what it is. I, I'm not even gonna get into it. I don't know if I'm hardwired weirdly or what. Other people may share the same disease, but no, I need this $4,000 ride-on mower. Long story short, of course, we did not get that mower. But what I wanted to bring to light was um, the need versus what an end user might go, oh no, we need this, we want this thing. And that's the difference too, because of course, in our example, there are plenty of other mowers that can totally get the job done. I don't have acres and acres that need to be mowed. I don't need a 54-inch deck or anything like that. As I'm scrolling through the Lowe's website and my eyes are getting all big, this would be great. This is what I need. Of course, that's not the case, right? So we ended up with a much more sensible push mower that absolutely gets the job done. So at the end of the day, it's does the good what's the need there? What does it need to be done? So and those are the conversations that you need to have with your end user and your procurement staff, because you can save money. Also, that's just the way that the process needs to be, because in those some particular situations, the sole source conditions aren't really the case. So there's two different things there to kind of talk about. Um, is it really the need? And many times you would see, for instance, specs that come from an end user that if I were to copy and paste and put that into Google, guess what? It takes me directly to a some particular manufacturer specific website. That's that's a red flag there that your end user, it wasn't necessarily coming up with specifications. It was about, well, they want this one thing. So that's just a conversation that needs to be had. And if you have any specific questions about that, always reach out to your SPO, and they can answer those questions. So going back to if it's not 100% justified, many times too, depending on your agency and availability of people, end users back and forth, how long it takes um, to get information from your end user, many times you can save time by just going out and doing a normal small purchase. I've been a part of situations like that, and we've seen that way it was competitively bid. You go ahead and go through the the small purchase process, because your small purchase can be done within a few days. So rather than the back and forth of justifying a small purchase with sole source conditions, you can sometimes just go ahead and um, put it out, and maybe that one vendor is the only vendor that responds. Chances are at that point, maybe you're going to get a better price too, because it is competitively bid. Maybe not, but sometimes that could be the case. Okay, so let's move on to our next slide here. So that's kind of a higher level view. Now let's talk about a couple differences here in between 2,000 and 10,000 and above 10,000. So I have a link here to our CPO notice, and it's a really handy note. I'm just going to go ahead and go to it real quickly just to show you. I know we've talked about this a little bit before. Anytime we do our small purchase training, we're really training off of this CPO notice 2018.10. So it breaks down all of the different situations of the dollar value of a small purchase and then what that process would be. So you have, of course, under $2,000, it talks about they no waivers required, no SPO involvement is required. It's not set aside for small businesses. All of these, right? So it walks through each one of these scenarios. And what I did was, on our slide, is I just copy and pasted when it's the small purchase, when sole source conditions exist. So Small purchases when sole source conditions exist from $2,000 to $10,000. Again, if it's under $2,000, you do not have to, it does not need to necessarily go into bid buy unless your agency wants it to be in there. It is not set aside for small businesses. You essentially just go out and buy the thing. But under $10,000, excuse me, the state agency determines if a small purchase meets the sole source conditions, and then the state agency may source a single small business or non-small business vendor. Of course, right? Because if those sole source conditions exist, it doesn't matter whether that's a small business or not, because once again, you have to have that justification for this is the only vendor that can provide this. So in my case, my mower example, of course, I was shot down regarding that. But also under $10,000, no SPO involvement is required. And just remember to make sure that that state agency small purchase designation memo is attached in bid buy. So I'm going to do the next slide above $10,000, and then we'll talk about what will be different in your bid buy processes. Okay, so when it's above $10,000, that's when the SPO gets involved. Of course, the state agency can source a single small business or non-small business vendor, because once again, if you have that justification for a sole source condition, it doesn't, it's not appropriate, or it wouldn't matter whether it's a small business or not. Okay, and then there's a handy dandy table here that's on that CPO notice that I just copy and pasted in here as well for your convenience, and you can see sole source is the procurement condition, 2000 to 10. Is it set aside? No. Do you need a waiver? No. And of course, it's not applicable for the signatory on the waiver. Above $10,000, you have it's not set aside, and you don't need a waiver. However, you will need the small purchase with sole source conditions form completed, because that's the information that you need to justify to the SPO whether that sole source condition exists. Now, you're able to use that same form for less than $10,000. That's going to be more of an agency condition, but we provided that form so that there would be consistency across the board. It's information that would always need to be justified to the SPO no matter what. But that form, and we'll get to it in just a second, that form is, of course, you could use it for small purchase with sole source conditions under 10,000 too. It's just that we don't require it under 10, but we do require it above 10. Okay, so now let's shift to the bid buy process. So we talked about the high level differences and what a small purchase with sole source conditions is, but now that once you have your justification, we're going to put it into bid buy. What's different than a normal small purchase? Okay, and like I said, I'm not going to get into bid buy and actually walk through all of this just because that'll take a little bit more time. But if you do want to see an example of that, we can certainly provide that for you. So under $10,000, you remember, so a small purchase under $10,000, we are just creating the requisition, and you're doing all the activities at the requisition, and then it will go to a purchase order. So under $10,000, in the notes tab, you're going to put small purchase with sole source conditions. That's just so you're able to document and you can see it in the notes tab that they are a small purchase with sole source conditions. Really, that was the only place that we could put it, because the bulletin description, which we will put it in the above $10,000, is only at the bid, and so the notes tab is where you can document the sole source conditions exist on a small purchase. And then in the vendors tab, of course, we're used to adding all vendors, right? When we're receiving quotes from our vendor community. In this case, when sole source conditions exist, you're only going to be selecting that one vendor, because once again, you've justified that, and if it gets approved, you only need to add that one vendor. So not all the vendors registered for that NIGP code, just the one vendor. And then for a small purchase with sole source conditions, $10,000 and over. Once again, that $10,000 is where the SPO approval is required. So you would do your requisition the way you normally would. In this case, you're just following the job aid. You don't have to put in the notes tab if it's over $10,000, because we're going to easily be able to document that in the bulletin description if it's over $10,000. So that's kind of the difference there. And all of these, I had just copied and pasted from our job aid. So once I walk through this, I'll go out and just kind of show you on the job aid where it clearly says, it just puts in these little notes saying, hey, if sole source conditions exist, then do this. Okay, so for example, in the bulletin description, if sole source conditions exist, you'd put in your bulletin description normally whatever you normally would. Department of Agriculture seeks to find a vendor, blah, 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 et cetera, whatever you normally would put, just a description of the procurement, but then include small purchase with sole source conditions. That way, if someone were to open up that bid, maybe from just from an audit standpoint or an SPO or an APO or anybody looking back at the bid, it's easily delineated that yes, and clearly marked, this had sole source conditions. As for an electronic response field, you're going to uncheck that. The system automatically defaults to checking it, right? Because most of the time we are receiving electronic responses. So we want to uncheck that to make it clear that you're not even going to be allowed to bid on this because it's a sole source condition. Let's see, rolling enrollment. That's another one. We're going to go ahead and check that. It defaults to being unchecked normally, but in this case, we want to check it because that allows you to go ahead and add the quote for that vendor immediately prior to that bid opening date. So you wouldn't have to wait until the bid opening date to go ahead and put in the quote for the vendor. So you can just move through the process quicker because once again, you have that justification for the sole source at that point. And so there's no need to wait until that bid opening date to move through and do your bid tab information to get it to PO. And then finally, one of the other fields is this a small business set-aside procurement? Yes or no, and then there's a note there that says, if sole source or emergency conditions exist, select no. Because once again, it's not set aside for small businesses. It's different than our other small purchases that are normally set aside for our SBSP vendors. Okay, oh, and finally, missed one at the bottom there. So the SPO is to add the bidders on the bids. Now, if the agency happens to put the bidders here, that's okay. It's just I'm reflecting what our new process is where SPOs are adding all of our bidders. So in this case, it's very similar to if it was under $10,000. We're only selecting the one vendor, not all vendors that are registered for that NIGP code. Okay, if the agency happens to put that in there, especially in this case when there are sole source conditions, I would anticipate that sometimes the agency might add that. You're not required to, as since we have recently changed that process so that the SPO is adding all bidders across the board on everything. That way, it just makes it easier. We did have the discussion where if we just say all SPOs are adding all the bidders across the board, it makes it consistent. But like I said, if the agency does happen to select the bidder here, that's totally fine. But the SPO will be making sure that that gets added there. And so one thing that you will see if you do not add bidders, when you submit for approval, you will get a yellow warning that says, hey, no bid bidder, which is just telling you that, hey, you didn't select any, there's no vendors here in the bid, or there's no bidders in the bidders tab, and you just hit continue. That's okay. You will see that. Okay, and then this is the slide that I'm just going to leave up here on all of them that just shows how you can find the Training Tuesday and the Bid by Training links, the monthly Bid by Training links, and I'll leave those there. So let's, I don't see any questions. Of course, if you do have any questions, always feel free to reach out. Many of these small purchases with sole source conditions. Oh, that's what I was going to do. Sorry. As soon as I said that, it reminded me. I'm going to go out and show you that small purchase with sole source conditions form. Let's see. There it is. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is the form that we created. It's very similar to the some questions from the sole source justification form. It's just aren't nearly as many. So you can see there's just a handful of fields. And this is the information that the SPO is going to be required to have in order to approve. So you have the bid by bid number, short description, vendor, estimated value, and really it's just it's this business rationale that just gives a little bit of history, and what is this? Why is it? Why is there the sole source conditions exist? Okay, and so once again, you can utilize this form. I mean, that's going to be an agency decision. You can utilize this form below $10,000, and your agency can decide that it's just not required for that. We still need the justification. Your APO will need the justification for why the sole source conditions exist. And above $10,000, you'll see on our job aid in the attachments tab that is required. Okay, so if I go back to our job aid here, I did want to show you guys not just the copy and paste, but to see where I was pulling some of those things from. So I'm going to scroll down to the bid part. Bid, and here it is. So you can see in the bulletin description, if sole source conditions exist, include this. Sole source condition and emergency condition only. You're going to uncheck the electronic response, check the rolling enrollment, so you can go ahead and add the quote, and then you would select no for the is this a small business set-aside procurement. Moving down in our attachments tab, this is where you would see the small purchase with sole source conditions form if it's applicable. Okay. And then, of course, the bidders tab too, where we talk about you'd select your vendors. If sole source or emergency conditions exist, you only select the one vendor. All right. And our fun fact of the day, it's National Administrative Professionals Day. Also known as Secretary's Day or Admin Day, recognizes the professionals who keep an office running smoothly every day. The day recognizes the work of secretaries, admin assistants, receptionists, and other administrative support professionals. Central to any business, these professionals keep an office organized and efficient. We appreciate you out there keeping us on track. Thank you. And then our quote of the day is, "Someday is not a day of the week." Henry David Thoreau. Although I did see this quote attributed to a few other people, so that's the interwebs for you. But someday is not a day of the week. I love that. Do we have any other final questions? We do. We do have a question. Yeah, I see you're asking a question after your training, if that's possible. But I think this is a great question. If you're utilizing a sole source, does the vendor have to be registered in BidBuy? So this is a great question for everybody. So I want to answer it in front of the group. Yes, in order for any vendor to be awarded in BidBuy, so this would be anything above $2,000 that's being conducted in BidBuy, they have to be registered in BidBuy. Otherwise, you aren't able to select them in order to proceed with the award and then move to PO. Good question there. Yep. Anytime that anytime you're utilizing a vendor, they need to be in BidBuy. Of course, unless it's under that $2,000, right? Where that's the threshold to be putting in documents in procurement. Oh, beautiful. And I love that. Perhaps someday you'll get your zero-turn mower. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Hey, have a great rest of your week. The slides will be out soon, and the video will be posted per usual. Thanks, everybody.